founded by the United Nations, reports on how climate change is in effect and its consequences. Possible consequences, according to Stefan Ramsdorff, a scientist from the Potsdam Institute for Consequences on Climate Change in Germany. He states that what already takes place is the pole caps in Greenland and the Antarctica melt. Possibly they could lead to a 67-meter sea level rise if they melt as a whole, but they've already started. The other problem that we face is melting permafrost, especially in Russia and Canada, which releases methane, a greenhouse gas, which increases the greenhouse effect. And then we face droughts and more extreme weather events on the daily almost worldwide. The last 5 years have been the hottest 5 years ever recorded. And what could still take place are huge migrations. About 200 million people fleeing from climate change results are expected. Overall, climate change will, as it proceeds, exacerbate today's still small problems, like, for example, the sea level rise, which hasn't had a great effect yet. And what is also feared of greatly are conflicts about food and resources, which are going to be more scarce in the future, to end fatal for the international community by starting wars. So obviously, the Paris Climate Accord has been made as a response to that. It was created on December 12th, 2015, and aims to keep the global heating up of the global climate under 2 degrees, with the ambition to keep it under 1.5 degrees Celsius too. Until 2050, the greenhouse gas effect is aimed to be neutralized. And almost all countries in the world, except Angola, Eritrea, Iraq, Iran, Yemen, Libya, South Sudan, or Turkey, have signed the accord, with the US posing the only exception of leaving the accord following Donald Trump's tries on that. Why the Paris Climate Accord has to be enforced more strongly is because right now it hasn't proven too effective yet. We already know there is change. For instance, the EU has decreased its emissions by 25% to its measurements in 1990. But obviously that is not enough, as climate change poses such a great threat. So the Paris Climate Accord was actually designed as a not firm agreement. So it has to be the goals that each country sets after the Paris Climate Accords for itself have to be reevaluated every 5 years, because in the year the Climate Accord was created, they weren't high enough. So why it has to be enforced more strongly is because this reevaluation hasn't happened too effective yet. For example, in February, there was one of the EU climate conferences, COP25 is its short name for it. It took place in Madrid, and it was the due date basically for these resubmissions of the goals, and only 3 countries had resubmitted and changed the goals. For example, Norway, but neither the EU nor China nor any other great names on the list. So now that there was a virtual conference on December 12th, also only 20 countries have submitted their new goals. So really, this is a problem we face if we really want to enforce what the Paris Climate Accord, which is actually a great thing, a great multilateral thing in the world, if we want to reach that. So The lack of international enforcement also correlates with no options being stated in the accord itself. There are no sanctions whatsoever for any countries that don't meet their goals or don't help to meet the goal, even though everyone says we want to meet the goal. So really, it is a voluntary agreement. The EU calls this a bottom-up agreement, not a top-down, like the Kyoto Protocol, for instance, that was setting limits on the countries of what they had to spend. And now the Paris Climate Accord is living for every country's own initiative. And that proves to be sort of fatal in some instances. There are, how I mentioned, no sanctions. So what would be possible maybe are insurance payments, for instance, payments that could be made to the World Bank or any other institutions as a guarantee that this or that country will meet their own goals and then receive the money back. And if they don't, this insurance money could be used to help, for example, the global south, which will probably suffer the most under the consequences of climate change. But despite that, the transition we have to go through in order to not suffer too much under climate change are not even that much of a problem. We hear populists like Donald Trump every day cry out how impossible it would be to finance all these undergoings. And I find this not to be true because, for example, the German Association of Worker Unions and various other sources report that the transition we go through in order to combat climate change creates more new jobs. And looking at Tesla, for example, Elon Musk's electric vehicle company, we see that it breeds innovation. And we also know that, for instance, with technologies like artificial intelligence, we can combat climate change because we make things more effective. So there is not much of a problem because also many industries will be able to be saved from being extinct through combating climate change through initiatives like hydrogen initiatives. The German economic magazine Wirtschaftswoche cites the Boston Consulting Group on a market analysis for hydrogen, which will most likely rise extremely in the next years, also in parts because of the German government's hydrogen strategy. So many industries will use hydrogen in order to kind of turn green. For in instance, the steel industry, but also the aviation or shipping industry will be able to run on hydrogen. Technically, they are today already. And on the ability to change, the German Fraunhofer Institute, which is publicly trusted and also funded and regarded as a serious institute worldwide, they have made a study based on models that shows that, for example, Germany, which is one of the leaders most certainly in turning green worldwide, as you could call it, that it is possible for Germany to meet all its climate goals and do that by 2050, as the Paris Climate Accord says. So we have the physical abilities, we have the financial abilities, and we have the scientific abilities, and we have also the reasons for all the three of them. This is why the Paris Climate Accord needs to be more enforced and why it is realistic, or it would be very responsible to enforce it more strongly.
Are you completed?
Yes, I am. Sorry.
All right.
Yeah.
No, it's okay. That was great. I personally do not have any questions right now. I'm going to open it up to the rest of the audience and Ishka and Aliyah. So anyone that does have a question, you can ask them now, or if anyone would like to present evidence to the contrary of Elvin's information, please do so now.
Okay, I'm gonna ask a couple questions if that's okay. Okay,
Sure.
awesome. So first I want to talk about your PCA statistic where it was talking about how emissions went down 25% opposed to 1990. So when was this statistic taken? Like when did you, like what year did they measure this?
Well, it is on the, I assume it must be on today's standard. I actually
2020.
don't, I can give you a source. It is a German online report on it by a bunch of journalists that have, well, that consult on reporting about climate change. But I am not sure. They cite an expert from the, yes, now I remember. They cite an expert from the Potsdam Institute on the consequences of climate change. So
Okay.
that's where it's from.
Okay. So then my next question is, so what exactly does the Paris Climate Accord entail? Like, what are the limitations, or is it like specific to each country? Like, what is the Paris Climate Accord?
The Paris Climate Accord is more of an agreement that climate change poses a threat to humanity, and an agreement on lowering carbon emissions to a net zero by optimally 2050, but ultimately to 2100.
Okay. Countries
Yeah.
countries can like do anything essentially that they want to, as long as it like lowers emissions.
Essentially, yes. There are obviously discussions about things like terraforming, which would be, for instance, installing, if I could say it so profoundly, sun blockers as like artificial clouds, for instance. But terraforming is a thing that is, I don't know, that the international community has agreed on very long ago not to do because it is too dangerous, despite things that like causing greenhouse emissions are already some sort of terraforming, but of which we weren't in control until now. So really, yes, the countries can do almost anything to do it. The most effective thing has been to reduce your carbon emissions and also to capture carbon emissions. Most definitely. For example, Ethiopia in Africa has joined the, let me search for it. Has joined the Green Legacy campaign. You might remember when they planted almost 400 million trees in the last year. So those recapturing technologies in the northern, more wealthy countries, you also see where they that startups that produce machines to recapture carbon from the air. All those things can be part of the strategy.
Okay.
But ultimately, what is measured are the emissions.
Okay, cool. So you also towards the end, so if you're saying that like the Paris Climate Accord has already caused these really beneficial impacts, why do we need to enforce it more? Like what is it, where's the need that we have to enforce it more if it's already working really well?
Yeah, sure enough. The problem is essentially that the clock is ticking. We could, I mean, you might think that when the world or the global climate has reached, for example, 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius, we could simply reverse it. But the problem is that there are many so-called points of no return. For instance, in Greenland, experts already fear that one of these points of no return has been reached, because when the ice melts, it seems to slide down, for example, hills in more warm zones, and you can simply push it up. So it will always keep going down in warm zones where it will be melting faster, where it slides down in more warmer zones. So you know what I mean, right? So these points of no returns are points where cascades of consequences are started. So that is what sets a limit, and that's why we have to keep ourselves from reaching the 2 degrees limit, and even better, the 1.5 limit. But the thing limiting us is the number of carbon dioxide tons that we can still emit until we reach that point. So after our speed of emitting carbon dioxide today, we have about 24 years to meet the 2 degrees limit. And for the 1.5 degrees limit, we have about 7 years, even though many experts already cite that theoretically we already have met the 1.5 limit, because there are also many factors like air pollution that cool the climate down, but they are unreliable, as when we turn onto things like electric vehicles, all these air pollution emissions will go down eventually, and then will reveal the 1.5 degrees we have already met by carbon dioxide emission.
Okay, thank you. That's all for me.
Thank you too.
Anyone else? I have a quick question. So your argument is very well formulated. I would like to ask, just personally, whether you believe that the Paris Climate Accord is at right now the most effective that it could be, and if there are any changes that you would propose to make it more effective. Do you think it's something that the governments need to change? Do you think it's something in the agreement that has to change? Or do you honestly believe that it is the most effective that it could be right now? Not that it should be more strongly enforced, but do you think that it is a well-formulated agreement?
I do think so. The problem, I mean, we can never talk about the most optimal deal, because I believe that at such a international and multilateral agreement, it would be impossible to be ideal. Simply because of the clash in cultures and politics, that would make it impossible. So that is what I think is also great about the climate agreement, that it is, as for example the EU calls it, bottom up. So of course its big weakness is self-responsibility by each country, and I see that. But we also see that some countries join it simply in solidarity, and if then another leader of the country comes to lead in years after that, the country has already joined it and then has a basis to justify policy making on that. So the weakness of self-initiative on the one hand is also its strength, because it has made 184 countries join the agreement, and I think that is the greatest strength of it. But yeah, sure enough, we will have to rely on responsibility of each country, and that's also why I think initiatives like Fridays for Future and climate activism in general is such an important and great deal these days.
Great, thank you. And how do you think that it should be more strongly enforced? What do you think is the most effective way to enforce an agreement that relies so heavily on self-responsibility from national governments?
Yeah, sure. I think it is very hard to enforce it more strongly, but the necessity is given simply because we face such a big crisis, and because not the initiative hasn't been taken so much in the last years, as I've stated in my speech. So what I've also proposed in my speech is, for instance, insurance payments. It is pretty unrealistic that this idea is going to be taken up, but it would be a good idea, because countries that are not fulfilling their goals will have their money that they will paid as an insurance payment not be given back, but this money could be used to support lands in the global south suffering from the already consequences of climate change. So for instance, we could install it as payments by each country to the World Bank. And if the trust in the World Bank is not big enough, it could be a payment adjusted yearly, and then there would be yearly goals to be met. And if they're not met, well, basically you fall in debt to the World Bank. Or if they are met, you can you could basically just leave it there and not put in more money for the next year because you didn't take it out. I think it would be a good model for these insurance payments, simply, well, because just like the Paris Climate Accord, it is about self-responsibility, but it's also about money. And in these times of huge neoliberalism in the world, where money basically rules everything, it would be possible. And I think the amounts that each country would have to be spent should be actually according to their historical emission of CO2. So this would especially impact countries like the US and Germany, or countries in the EU in general, because they have emitted over time the most carbon dioxide. And then the other factor it should be tied to should be actual emissions at the moment, current emissions. So that is how we would catch China, for instance, too. But the good thing about it is developing countries in, for example, East Asia, not China anymore. I don't think we should state it as a developing country still. But these countries would maybe have to pay for their current emissions, but not for their historical emissions, because they simply almost don't exist. So I think it would be more fair than tying it to things like the GDP, for instance, where it would be hitting pretty unfairly and punishing unfairly countries that haven't really emitted anything in the last millennial and now have to pay something for it. So I think we should resolve it by insurance payments, but it is unlikely. It is unlikely, unfortunately.
Well, the good thing about these debates is that they are just theoretical. So
Yeah.
Great job. I'm sure everyone here enjoyed it. I'm really proud. I'm very grateful to have listened to this and to have judged this. You'll receive, obviously you move on regardless, but you will receive your rubric sometime tomorrow night, as well as information for the following week's debate. So your resolution,
Great.
your side, and dates and times.
Okay, awesome. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Have a great night.
You too.
Bye.
Bye.